complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. Today's episode is the last in a special three-part series based on Views from Taipei, essays by young Indian scholars on China, a compendium published recently by Carnegie India. The People's Republic of China has grown in power over the past several decades, and this power has allowed it the diplomatic and military capabilities to articulate and advance its interests, including its territorial interests. Particularly in the past 15 years, and particularly under Chinese President Xi Jinping, China's foreign policy and its neighborhood policy has taken a far more assertive turn. China's neighbors, particularly those which it is involved in territorial disputes with, India, Japan, Philippines, and also Taiwan, which is far more than a territorial dispute, of course, have felt this assertion and heightened Chinese posture. How do scholars make sense of this posture? What drives it, and how does it manifest? And what of China's recent re-engagement with its neighborhood amidst global geopolitical churn? I'm Sahib Singh Chadda, a senior research analyst in security studies at Carnegie India. Joining us for this episode is a distinguished guest, Adil Brar. He is one of the contributors to Views from Taipei, and his essay, From Land Border to the High Seas, Beijing Signaling at India, Taiwan, and the Philippines, looks at China's strategy in its border disputes. Adil Brar is a journalist and international affairs analyst based in Taipei, currently a reporter at Taiwan Plus News. His reporting focuses on international security, US-China relations, and East Asian security. Previously, he was a China news reporter for Newsweek and has contributed to the BBC World Service, The Print India, and National Geographic. In 2023, he was a Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs Fellow and a visiting scholar at National Chengchi University in Taipei. I've also spoken with the other two authors from the compendium in the past weeks. So stay tuned for this episode as we unpack different dimensions of China's military, economy, and border strategy through the lens of young Indian scholars. Adil, welcome to Interpreting India.
Thank you, Sahib. Thank you for having me on the show.
It's a real pleasure to have you. I'll start off with a broad question. It's generally been known that China has attempted to change facts on the ground along various frontiers since Xi Jinping has been in power. If I could ask you, what novel insights are gained from your comparative analysis of the developments along each frontier, the LAC and with the Philippines and Taiwan?
Thank you for that question. I set off to write this essay for Carnegie India with a mission or overall point of view that the India-China border has not been discussed in the same vein as some of these other, land disputes or disputes that China has in the maritime space with South China Sea countries as well as Taiwan. So India's border or the land border, the LAC, has been looked at a very different lens when we compare that to China's own disputes in other parts of the region. So my assessment was that why are we looking at the India-China border in a different lens? There's something that China is doing right now is creating a strategic space for itself around its neighborhood. For the longest time, the large swathes of land in the India-China border sector were largely empty. There were no major presence of Chinese soldiers, or even the local population in these regions were declining for a long time. But in the recent years, especially since Xi Jinping came to power, he started articulating a new idea of border regions and tying the border region with the idea of security and protecting those areas. So he has articulated this idea of Bianfang Anchuan, which is protecting the borders, securing the borders. And this term was initially mentioned by Xi Jinping in the beginning of 2020. And that's around the same time when we had the tensions between India and China flare up. So the whole notion of this paper is that we have looked at Taiwan. Taiwan remains one of the leading reasons for China's security direction. It's one of the driving factors behind how or why China does certain things in the region, as well as some of the disputes in the South China Sea with Philippines and other countries. But the India-China border has not been looked at in the same vein as the issue of Taiwan or the disputes in the South China Sea. So I tried to make an argument that we need to look at broader patterns within this region, and why is the case of India-China border, it should be treated in a similar way, to look at what's going on broadly in this region, and why is China acting in a certain way, in an assertive way, to impose its own security calculation on its neighbors and its broader calculation on how it can become a regional hegemon. And that's where I'm coming from in this paper.
So is there, dare I say, a risk of being reductive in this comparative analysis? There's certainly similarities in each case studies, and there's broader sort of takeaways that you can get from comparing the India-China border and disputes with Taiwan, with Philippines. But if I could ask you, what are the differences in each case that don't add up in the cases that you explore in your piece?
Yeah, and thanks for asking that question. I think there are some differences that don't align with the case of India-China border, also the disputes in the seas. Because in the case of South China Sea, the dispute is with multiple countries. So the driving factors are different. And the history of these disputes are also different. The dispute with, in the case of Taiwan Strait, is entirely a different case study. But in the sense that I'm trying to make an argument that the actions that China has taken in the past years have a direction to create a strategic space for itself. And so if we look at the differences, what are the differences? The timelines in all these cases may not always align with the beginning of the actions vis-a-vis Taiwan Strait or South China Sea. But in my analysis, I argue that some of these incursions in the Taiwan Strait, when they started picking up, initially with the incoming Tsai Ing-wen presidency, and also we saw similar tensions at the India-China border in case of Doklam. So there are certain overall similarities that may sometimes sound reductive, but we have only a limited set of evidence to work with. China remains a closed-off country, so we may not have full access to the internal thinking, internal processing. But looking at purely the actions and comparing the timelines, there are definitely some similarities, but there are also differences. Because in the case of South China Sea, the building of the islands in the South China Sea started in 2012 and 13. So it may not exactly align in terms of China's actions. And China has been assertive. That's a fact that we all know from various media reporting and analysis in various think tanks. But I argue that the India-China border here remains intimately linked because of overall strategic calculation that China has, how it wants to secure its border regions going forward. Because under Xi Jinping, there is a push towards creating strategic space for China, which can allow it to become a regional hegemon. And it may have been articulated in the past as well by other Chinese leaders, but Xi Jinping has given a very unique take on how China should look at its own region, how it should assert its power vis-a-vis its neighbors. And that is why I think these similarities do stand out and create a good case for what's happening at the India-China border, and how it has some parallels with the case of the Taiwan Strait as well as South China Sea.
Did you see China's escalation along the India-China border in 2020, in the summer in eastern Ladakh, where it attempted to change the status quo in 7 separate friction points? Did you see that as an attempt to create strategic space?
Let me start with we need to go back a little bit. When did these tensions actually start flaring up in that region? If we look at, and I did look at some of the satellite imagery that was available to me, and I looked at the evidence of, how they slowly started building some helipads and barracks and roads in Ladakh. But that started in August 2019. So I had similar examples in case of the Taiwan Strait. So there are some helipads that the construction of these helipads begin around sometime in mid-2019. So if we look at India-China border, China started slowly building these infrastructures with a plan of changing the reality on the ground. So purely looking at what was going on prior to summer of 2020 when the tensions flared up. There is quite significant evidence to show that China was moving certain resources to this region. They may not have moved the forces at that point in August 2019, but they had broken ground to build infrastructure for maybe a future deployment of these soldiers. That's what we saw eventually sometime in March and April when, the world was facing COVID pandemic. China moved multiple units of their forces to this part of, LAC. And that planning was in the works, and maybe there was some evidence which was not picked up by India to respond to that deployment. But if you purely look at some of this satellite imagery analysis, we can see that they had started working on this, and which I argue is broadly part of creating the strategic space and creating a new calculus where China is the one that gets to first set the rules of engagement, a new normal that I use in my writing, a new normal vis-a-vis Taiwan Strait as well as vis-a-vis India.
In your piece, you talk about the chain reaction thesis, in which Chinese strategists sort of perceive that an escalation along one frontier is an opportunity for other parties along other frontiers to capitalize and escalate on other frontiers as well. Can you talk about this thesis a bit?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sahib, for picking that particular point. And I think drawing that comparison, as you just did, with strategic encirclement vis-a-vis the argument that I made in my paper about chain reaction, they're essentially very similar terminologies to explain China's actions, but there are certain differences. Strategic encirclement is an idea which has roots into other kind of scenarios that China could respond to in the future. It could be very much to do with domestic chaos, which could result from domestic issues, protests within China. So China might look at what could happen on its borders if there is internal turmoil within China, how to respond to that, how to secure its borders, especially in Xinjiang. So the term that I had, used in my writing was Liansuo Fanning Dai, which was like chain reaction. The chain reaction argument is somewhat different in the sense that we are looking at a broader history of, China, where they have always been concerned about certain actions being taken vis-a-vis Xinjiang. But that historical framing of how to secure the western borders versus the eastern borders has now been reanalyzed and reinterpreted into the current scenario. So in the way I use that term is largely to do with how the strategic analysts in China are looking at what could happen in Taiwan Strait and how could maybe India or other parties, including the US, could use that opportunity to attack certain border regions in quest to maybe take territory or counter China's action in the Taiwan Strait. So my use of the chain reaction term was very specific to the Taiwan Strait scenario. But the idea of strategic encirclement also draws on is a broader term that looks at wider case studies of what could happen if there is certain scenarios where China faces security threat, maybe internal, maybe external, and how does it respond to that. And largely, if you look at the writing of scholars like Taylor Fravel, he has articulated that the action that China has taken vis-a-vis its neighbors or conflicts has usually been driven by internal calculations of China, and that remains the case. And if you were to see a conflict in this region involving China, it will still be driven by internal calculus of how the Communist Party, thinks, analyzes what's going on in this region and how they think they need to react. So my argument was that the chain reaction thesis actually quite well ties India with what's going on in the Taiwan Strait, that they would need to secure the India-China border because they would be very much concerned about losing certain regions if there is conflict in Taiwan Strait, because they would have to move their forces around. And at that point, there is a legitimate concern that other powers could use that as a leverage, as an opportunity to tie down China somewhere else if they were to take an action vis-a-vis Taiwan Strait. But yes, these terms are in a sense very similar, but my use of chain reaction was very specific to the Taiwan Strait scenario and tying the India-China border to what's going on broadly in this region.
So another conceptual sort of statement you make in the piece is that China shifted the narrative of defending borders from a maximalist approach to one of national sovereignty. Can you explain this further? Because my impression is that shifting the narrative on borders from a question of, simply geographical territory and resources to a question of national sovereignty is putting more layers on it, is attaching more importance to it, and is a more maximalist, tougher approach.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the sense that why has China decided to make a national sovereignty argument to protect its borders is because for a long time, the Communist Party has remained cognizant of, what's going on in its borders, and they have tried to create a systematic infrastructure in these areas to secure them through not just, military presence, but through actually kind of a social engineering mechanism, moving people around, moving villagers to border areas. Those attempts have in the past failed. And so with Xi Jinping, he has tried to give a new twist to, looking at the West, looking at broader border regions and not ignoring these further away regions, which may look like secure at this moment, but articulating that concern that we need to pay attention to these border areas. So it is, in a way, a maximalist approach to, creating a scenario where we need to defend each inch of the Chinese territory. And that's what we've seen with the propaganda pieces that have come out from China, that we are not going to lose a single piece of land that is Chinese and has historically been claimed by China. So that is what allows China to extend its claim. It has repeated a version of this argument in the past, but by giving a new twist of national sovereignty is something that once again adds more weight to its claims that China feels has been ignored, and it has to add more weight to its claim vis-a-vis, Arunachal Pradesh, vis-a-vis Ladakh, because international audience would understand why China claims Taiwan Strait, and they would have some difficulty processing maybe how does China's claims in the South China Sea or the India-China border have a very similar kind of claim as China has in the Taiwan Strait. So it has tried to put more weight to its claim by articulating this national sovereignty argument. And this is something you see all across the propaganda pieces by the party, and the idea of Bianfang Anchuan, which is the border security. If you look at the documents, especially Xi Jinping's own speech, the idea of border security is loosely used in a way that it covers a large set of claims, not just the land border claims, but also the claims in the seas, and which is a very unique take that Xi himself has articulated, though there were different versions of that even earlier with Hu Jintao. But he has given a new twist to it with more weight to it. And that is why I would say the argument of national sovereignty is a very unique take that Xi has offered to extending China's claims.
So since we're on the India-China border, in your piece, you say that no direct connection exists in the case of India-China tensions to significant sort of political events in that relationship. I'm curious as to what brings you to that conclusion, because I can think of at least two examples where there's perhaps a connection. One is, for example, the standoff in 2014 in Chumar. One hypothesis, at least, is that was meant to test the resolve of the new Narendra Modi government. And then, for example, in 2019, one of the theses for why China did what it did in 2020 is that it perceived India turning Ladakh into a union territory in August 2019, federally administered from Delhi. China perceived that a certain way. And so I'm just curious, especially as you just said that the build-up for 2020 appears to have started in August 2019. I'm curious as to how you conclude that there's no significant correlation between the political events and tensions on the border.
Thanks for that question. That's an excellent question. The reason I say there are still no direct connection to political calculus in terms of what China has been doing at the India-China border is because they have not publicly articulated that. So if China were to articulate that, they've done that in the case of Taiwan Strait. A lot of the propaganda clearly states why they are doing certain exercises, why are they acting in a certain way. And similarly, in the case of South China Sea, when there are major exercises that lead up to certain response from China. In the case of India-China border, the reason in August 2019, it may have started, building that infrastructure, but in the case of the India-China border, the planning for that may have started even prior to 2019. So my overall argument why we don't see a direct connection is that China has, and we can clearly trace China's action in Taiwan Strait, and even in the case of South China Sea, where they directly respond to certain activities in this region. But in the case of India-China dispute, they have not publicly articulated why certain exercises have happened. And that may have to do with the dyad that India and China have. China may not want to escalate tensions beyond a certain point, or they may want to hide their intentions in a certain way, mask them. But at this point, we don't have any good argument, at least from the Chinese sources, that why have they responded to certain actions, maybe by India, maybe due to geopolitical connections. We don't have the hard evidence to prove that as of yet, but maybe we do get that evidence in the future. There's some Chinese scholars articulating that, India was getting close to the US. India was, at that point, the first Trump presidency, was creating a scenario where US was opening certain sectors for India, especially defense cooperation and other particular sets of interests were emerging, and maybe China was responding to that. But I still have to see a concrete sort of evidence coming out of China, which may be official or almost semi-official, to link some of these activities to what's going on in the Taiwan Strait. Sure, there may be a geopolitical calculus to China response in the case of India-China border, because LAC for a long time on the Chinese side in the Ladakh sector was quite empty according to China. And I've come across certain arguments which do align with this thinking that we have not secured this section of the border. We need to act. But there is no clear connection as of to why in 2020 the way they happen. Sure, there's this thesis, as you just mentioned earlier, that it may have to do with the Ladakh being turned into a union territory, but we still have not seen that evidence to make the argument that China has, in case of LAC, responded to these activities because of certain political developments. Clearly linked and clearly articulated evidence which can prove they have responded to India's actions.
Thanks. I think that's an interesting answer and that's an argument worth making. You talked about broader geopolitical tensions, broader strategic spaces, and I agree with you that these actions in various fronts by China are meant to create more strategic space, and that's at least the intention with which they carry it out. But we've seen that in several cases, that space has only ended up shrinking. India-US security cooperation has only deepened since 2020, since the crisis in Ladakh in the summer. Would that be your sense that China's strategic space has ended up shrinking because of its actions? And if that is the sense, is there any course correction by the Chinese that these attempts may not have necessarily borne fruit?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I like that question a lot. And we have seen in the recent months, China has at least made an attempt to course correct things with India. There's a lot of diplomacy going on. And I think there is some some narratives in China by some scholars that we can, address these concerns within the bounds of diplomacy. We don't have to escalate tensions beyond a certain point because we do need to keep India somewhat close. And China may have acted in a certain way which was detrimental to its own interests. It may have acted in a certain way that did destroy relations with India beyond a point that they didn't think it would. And India, under the prime ministership of Narendra Modi, appears to be different, and they have understood that they cannot create this kind of scenario where maybe India would get confused and may not align closely with India, as may have happened in the past. And that understanding has driven at least some course correction in the case of India-China border in the recent months. But it remains it remains kind of reactive. China remains reactive. There are developments in the region. We saw with the case of India-Pakistan, it has again somewhat become aggressive vis-a-vis what's happened between India and Pakistan. And it's trying to take a position which will once again maybe put India and China at odds. It has sought to address certain pressing issues by moving back soldiers from certain points where they were quite close, at least carry out some disengagement in these sectors, which it may not have had to, but China may have realized that it's not in their interest and it wanted to course correct. So it may have had a counterproductive, reaction for China, where actually their strategic space might have shrunk rather than as they thought it would have grown. So they've had to course correct, and I can see that they are trying to course correct in case of maybe in case of other disputes as well. But again, it's their way of thinking that what is the bottom line, and we really don't know what here remains the bottom line for China. Everybody remains in a guessing mode where China draws a line. But we need to also look at the fact that the soldiers that China had deployed in the India-China border remain there. They have not been moved back in substantial numbers. So in that case, it is trying to create a new normal. So that remains a strategic direction for China with some adjustment, with some tweaking here and there. But I don't think they are willing to make the sacrifice of, completely pulling down some of the helipads and other infrastructure, the barracks that they have built, because they are there for the long term. And there is a certain bottom line in terms of a strategic space. But sure, its actions, China's own actions, sometimes do fire back. And it looks like they may have overplayed their hand in case of India-China border.
Thanks. That's interesting. I want to come to the Taiwan frontier now. You talk about this at length in your piece. And my question is, what, according to you, is the point of China's strategy of creating a new military normal around Taiwan? Is it the proverbial boiling water situation where China steadily raises the temperature to the extent that peacetime exercises and war operations become indistinguishable before it's too late?
China's strategy vis-a-vis Taiwan Strait has been to create a new normal against Taiwan, where Taiwan struggles to respond in an adequate manner in the right time. And China's exercises, especially the ADIZ incursions, I've been covering a lot of these ADIZ incursions as a reporter here in Taiwan. They have taken a stance where they have done certain activities around Taiwan Strait, especially the ADIZ incursions on certain days. And there is something that makes it difficult for Taiwan to respond, especially we've seen the uptick in ADIZ incursions starting from 2019 onwards, and they have continued to grow over time. And in the recent months, I've seen they've been conducting these exercises, especially the ADIZ incursions, on a day which is roughly either Wednesday or a Thursday. And so they try different things to make it difficult for Taiwan to respond. And these patterns are changing every year. They're becoming more aggressive with the now use of aircraft carriers. The aircraft carriers move in a certain way. Right now, we have the Liaoning aircraft carrier just south. It was seen recently southeast of Taiwan, somewhere between Taiwan and Guam. And we also have the Shandong carrier still out at sea, somewhere in South China Sea. We have not been able to track that. But these exercises are becoming difficult to respond to for Taiwan, creating a new normal in the Taiwan Strait. And there's one very good example. We had an exercise in December 2024, which is when President Lai Ching-te was visiting some of the Pacific allies, and he was on a visit to that part of the world. And China amassed almost over 100 ships, and which Taiwan saw as an incoming response from China after President Lai Ching-te visited Hawaii as well. And it was in response to Taiwan's own actions, but the way Taiwan raised the alarm about that exercise was not seen in the same way as by the US. US saw that, sure, there are these significant number of ships, but maybe China is not doing the kind of significant exercise to respond to Taiwan. So it also put Taiwan and US's messaging at odds. And I think part of its calculus to do these spontaneous exercises, at times naming them, at times maybe not even naming them, as it's happening, especially right now. China has these aircraft carriers around Taiwan, and they are doing their own exercises, but they have not given it a name. We were expecting that there's going to be a significant exercise after President Lai Ching-te recently gave an anniversary speech after his 1 year in the office. But China has not given a name to these exercises, these activities, like it did in the past. So it's become difficult for Taiwan to respond. And at times, if it does, Taiwan does raise an alarm. Some of the countries in the region may not see the China's own activities in the same way. So people just get used to China's action, and that's what they are trying to do. That its incursions, its activities has become so normal that Taiwan accepts the term of the new normal that is being created within the Taiwan Strait.
So I have a follow-up question, and this is my last question. Your co-author in this compendium, Suyash Desai, argued on a previous episode of this podcast that the PLA doesn't appear ready for a Taiwan contingency and won't be by 2027, certainly, or maybe a few years thereafter. Why then is the PLA creating a new normal right now? Can it sustain this new normal and the costs that it brings for several years into the future up until a contingency takes place?
That's a very important question that many people are trying to figure out. And I agree with Suyash the way he articulated that China is not ready for a major mission against Taiwan. And it won't be ready in 2027, even by that deadline that China has set, because there are significant war mobilization activities that China needs to do for an operation in the Taiwan Strait. And we are not seeing those kind of mobilization efforts. It needs to change certain recruitment patterns. It needs to raise certain alarms. And we have not seen that kind of regional preparation it needs for a major operation. And if you look at some of the, efforts in the Eastern Theater Command and where China is doing things, they may have a modernization deadline by 2027, but it doesn't seem like they are in a significant way, stepping stones towards that major invasion of the Taiwan Strait and coming to take Taiwan. And that's largely because to do these things, it takes a organizational effort. And we've seen in recent months, there have been so many of these cases where senior leadership of the PLA has been removed or replaced. So there remains a top leadership issue in terms of preparing for a future where China may attack Taiwan. And we don't have enough evidence to connect some of the dots in terms of what's going on within the PLA leadership. But there's one example of He Wei-dong, who is a very senior leader in the military leadership. He was the person, according to some sources, they've said that he was the one who planned and executed the response to the Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan in August of 2022. And he is now somebody who's not been seen in public, and there are rumors about him being under investigation or being replaced. And there are significant leadership issues at the very top, which are creating impediments for China to prepare for a future invasion. But again, we need to remember that some of the decisions about a campaign against Taiwan would be driven by the top leadership, Xi Jinping himself, and articulation of their own interest and how Taiwan articulates its own idea of what it wants to be and where it wants to be in the future, and how Beijing interprets that. So this three-way tango that we have between China, Taiwan, and the US will be closely watched by Xi Jinping to decide a future campaign. And in terms of preparation, I agree with Suyash that they have a long way to go even to reach that 2027 deadline. They might even, announce a propaganda victory by saying they are ready in 2027, but that does not mean they're actually ready for a campaign in terms of their preparation, the hiring, the recruitment, the training. The training remains one of a major issue for China to mobilize their forces, and the issue of the replacement of soldiers, the retirement. Now they have 2 recruitments in a year, which is something China has been trying to create more space for, more training. And that's why it's also the reason it's exercising around Taiwan on these multiple occasions is to fix its problem of training with the soldiers. They lack leadership direction. So there are multiple evidence here and there that if we put them together, we can see their preparation for a conflict in the Taiwan Strait is not going according to the timeline that they may have set, at least at this moment as we speak.
Thanks, Adil. I think that's very interesting. Those are all the questions I have for you today. It's been a real pleasure to have you on Interpreting India. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I love to be back on the podcast and love to continue this conversation.
Absolutely. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts from. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us on our website at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on X, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. See you next time. Hello and welcome to a new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. This is part 2 of our special 3-part Interpreting China series based on Views from Taipei, essays by young Indian scholars on China, a compendium published recently by Carnegie India. The series brings together fresh perspectives from emerging Indian voices who have studied China from up close. Over 3 episodes, I'm speaking to the contributors of the compendium to explore China's military, economy, and border strategy. China's rise over the past 4 decades is well known, and much emphasis has been placed on China's economic rise, which we discussed last week in the episode on China's economy with Amit Kumar. Yet, equally important is another dimension of power, particularly hard power, that is, its military capabilities. China's armed forces, the People's Liberation Army, matters as much because the use of force and the threat of the use of force is another means through which states, including the People's Republic of China, advance their interests. Thus, the fortunes of the PLA matter for all states that have security competition or cooperation for that matter with China. Particularly in the past decade under Chinese President Xi Jinping, the PLA has undergone sweeping structural reforms, and it's worth exploring how these reforms have fared. I'm Sahib Singh Chadha, a senior research analyst in the Security Studies program at Carnegie India. Joining us for this episode is a distinguished guest, Suyash Desai. Suyash is one of the contributors to Views from Taipei, and his essay, The People's Liberation Army in the 2020s, Buoyed by Reforms, Limited by Roadblocks, outlines the sweeping structural reforms that President Xi Jinping has initiated inside the PLA, as well as their outcomes. Suyash is a non-resident fellow in the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a political scientist specializing in China's defense, foreign policies, and nuclear strategy. His research focuses on Chinese military affairs, security and foreign policy issues, nuclear strategy, India-China relations, and strategic and security developments in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific region. He also authors the PLA Bulletin, a newsletter providing news and analysis on the PLA. Suyash, welcome to Interpreting India.
Hi, Sahib. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. We'll start with a broad question on the People's Liberation Army's state of play. Can you tell us at the outset what is it doing right and succeeding in, and what are the challenges and roadblocks facing it? And you can draw on your piece for this.
I will come to my piece, but broadly speaking, I divide the People's Liberation of Army's past 10 years into 3 or 4 hits and three or four misses. The first hit is about rapid modernization across all domains. When we talk about all domains, we talk about land, we talk about sea, we talk about air, we talk about space, we talk about cyber, we talk about networks, and so on and so forth. So the modernization that it has achieved, especially after it started reforms in 2015, honestly speaking, the reform was started in 2003 itself, but under Xi Jinping, the reform got a kickstart, and the modernization that it has achieved is mind-blowing, and that is one of the most important hits for the PLA. The second one is heading towards multi-domain integrated joint operations. So from 1993, when PLA learned from, that is a specialty about the PLA, that it always learns from others' war. So 1993 was when Gulf War happened and it moved towards joint operation. And then it has shifted its focus towards multi-domain integrated joint operation in a localized areas. Why in a localized area? That's because all of China's main battles or main conflicts are in a localized area around its border. So for a